All right. Also joining us right now is WION correspondent Ollie Barrett, joining us live from London. Ollie, thank you so much for joining us. What can you tell us about the situation on ground following President Vladimir Putin's speech?
Well, probably more usefully, I can give you some reaction from the UK and talk about possible next steps. We've already heard from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He has tweeted to say, "I'm appalled by the horrific events in Ukraine." He says he has spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine to discuss what he calls next steps. Boris Johnson going on to say President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and destruction by launching this unprovoked attack on Ukraine. He says the UK and our allies will respond decisively, and that clearly becomes one of the crucial next questions, how decisively that response can be put into action and exactly what it will be from Western allies. Liz Truss, the UK Foreign Secretary, has reacted as well. She says, "I strongly condemn the appalling unprovoked attack President Putin has launched on the people of Ukraine." Liz Truss going on to say, "We stand with Ukraine and we will work with our international partners to respond to this terrible act of aggression." We've also heard from the UK representative to the United Nations, who was involved in that meeting that was going on essentially as President Putin announced that the war would be beginning. Ambassador Barbara Woodward saying, "As we sat in the United Nations Security Council chamber tonight urging Russia to step back, President Putin announced special military operations on Ukrainian territory." The UK representative saying this is unprovoked and unjustified, and she also calls it a grave day for Ukraine and the principles of the United Nations. One other bit of reaction from UK officials that's worth bringing you is from Melinda Simmons, who is the British ambassador to Ukraine. She calls it also a wholly unprovoked attack on a peaceful country. She says she's horrified, and she says just because you're prepared and thought about this possibility for weeks and months doesn't mean it isn't shocking when it actually happens. And Melinda Simmons, of course, is in country herself. And then going back to where we started this train of thought, Boris Johnson talking about how to respond with allies. Clearly we know that the UK has further sanctions ready to go, as do other Western allies. I'm sure we can therefore expect them to be rolled out at some point in the coming days, if not sooner. Boris Johnson also announcing on Wednesday that further military support will be supplied to Ukraine, and he said that would come in the form of lethal defensive weaponry, a lot of which the UK has supplied already, and other military support for the Ukrainian military too. Exactly what form that will take, the UK government certainly on Wednesday wouldn't say, insisting that it would be a security issue to put too much detail on it. But we do know that, as I say, defensive weaponry has been supplied by the UK to the Ukrainian military for some time now, preparing for just this eventuality.
Right, Olina, like you mentioned, there is still no clarity on what form of support this will materialize into, and we know that diplomatic path hasn't yielded any results. So what concrete steps are we looking at here? You've spoken about training the forces here. What next?
Well, as I say, the possibility of further defensive weaponry being supplied by the UK, the possibility, I say possibility, there is the absolute certainty now that the UK will bring in tougher sanctions than it had already announced on Russian individuals, on Russian firms, on Russian organisations that are close to the Kremlin. The UK has been saying already this week that it's going to make it much harder for Russian entities and individuals to raise capital on UK markets. They're going to make it much harder for Russian companies to operate in the UK, particularly if it is not exactly clear where their funding comes from and whether there is any illicit cash, illicit funding involved. The UK has been talking about cracking down on tech exports coming out of Russia as well. So there are all sorts of areas that the UK can move further when it comes to sanctions. Then, of course, I'm sure we will see NATO meetings unfolding in the coming hours, and the UK has signalled before that it would be prepared to boost its troop contribution to NATO, perhaps in that Eastern European region now.
Right. Also, what can you tell us about the broader implications of Russia's efforts now to have a hold on the security framework here in the wider region, not just Ukraine?
Well, the UK and the US have not been giving any ground on that in negotiations so far. I suspect that the invasion that Vladimir Putin has launched doesn't change that calculus very much.
Right. Also, like we heard earlier that Russian president had said that efforts to negotiate with NATO were in vain. So does this essentially mean that there is no diplomatic path forward and Russia will not in fact return to the negotiating table at any point during this crisis?
That's a question for Vladimir Putin, and as Boris Johnson has said many times, the UK Prime Minister, he can't see inside his head. He doesn't know exactly what he's planning and exactly what he's thinking. The other side of that coin, of course, though, is that UK and US intelligence has been warning for some time that this eventuality that we're seeing unfold now is what Vladimir Putin has been planning for. Some countries dismiss that possibility, but I think UK and US intelligence officials will feel that they have been vindicated at least in their stressing of the gravity of the situation and the planning that Moscow was putting in place at the Ukrainian borders.
Right. Also, just how do you assess the role of the international community here? What steps does this leave Ukraine with, and how can the Western allies and the United States now aid Ukraine going forward? Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered military operations in Ukraine. There have been reports of explosions in Kiev and Kharkiv, and the situation is escalating exponentially now. There are questions about how Ukraine and United States and the Western allies can now navigate their way out of this crisis. The Russian defense minister also said that Russia was disabling Ukraine air defenses. Now, Putin announced military operations in Ukraine. This as the United Nations Security Council meeting was underway. Vladimir Zelensky also addressed the nation. He's called for citizens not to panic. Ukraine's military infrastructure has been attacked. It is a very perilous situation for the people of Ukraine. There are questions over how this situation will further unfold. Russia has carried out strikes in Ukraine, and this has increased threats in this crisis further. The decision by Vladimir Putin to launch military operations in Ukraine has intensified pressure, and Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of UK, has made it clear that the UK will not send troops to Ukraine if Russia launches a full-scale invasion. Right now, President Joe Biden too has condemned the attack and unprovoked aggression by Russia. There have been calls for Russia to return to the negotiating table. However, the situation still remains very unpredictable at this point. Ukraine is under attack along the Russia-Belarus borders. Belarusian troops have been joining the Russian troops as well. Now, President Putin made an address in the morning saying that I've made the decision of a military operation. This was a surprise statement. Putin also reiterated that Russia's attempts to agree on NATO non-expansion were in vain. So there are questions whether Russia will still take the diplomatic path forward or return to the negotiating table. He's vowed retaliation against those who interfere with Russian-Ukraine operation. And he says that Russia cannot feel safe or develop and exist with the constant threat from Ukraine. Let's just listen into what Vladimir Putin had to say. Before we go on further, let's just listen into his statements.
Обстоятельства требуют от нас решительных и незамедлительных действий. Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. В связи с этим, в соответствии со статьей 51 части 7 Устава ООН, санкции Совета Федерации России и во исполнение ратифицированных Федеральным собранием 22 февраля сего года договоров о дружбе и взаимопомощи с Донецкой Народной Республикой и Луганской Народной Республикой, мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
And earlier we were joined by Ray Locker. Let's just listen into his insights on the situation.
Well, he is absolutely a liar. He was lying when he said he had no intention to invade Ukraine. He showed that he's lied about that today. Why he's doing this is hard to understand. It really makes no sense from a geopolitical point of view. I mean, he must obviously fear something about Ukraine, a threat to him and his leadership, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, so many people are acting in bad faith about this. The Republicans who emboldened Putin during the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, who basically did whatever Putin wanted, and now they have the nerve to call Joe Biden weak for something that's happened, you know, because of Vladimir Putin, who they've been catering to for years. It's mind-boggling. And for the people here to worry about, well, my gas prices are going to go up this because we've stood up to a dictator who invaded a country that was absolutely no threat to him is just insanity in my view.
It's all about a continuum. So I think, like he mentioned, red lines. So you've got missiles in a certain part, but the number of missiles that can reach Moscow and the distance of all of them, all these things are calculated when it comes to their sort of defense strategies. So I think, you know, he drew a point here, and I think because of those sort of historical and cultural connections with Ukraine, he was going to draw Ukraine as the red line. And also, I think a lot of those other missiles in Eastern Europe were there before his time and before Russia was powerful enough to sort of retaliate. So I think Putin really sees this as a kind of a legacy move before he ends his time.